Welcome everybody to the Cambridge Festival and this great session, Is Populism Destroying the Media? I'm Dorothy Byrne, I'm the president of Mary Edwards College at Cambridge and the former head of news and current affairs at Channel 4, still a television journalist. With me I have Emily Maitlis, formerly of the BBC and now of the brilliant podcast The News Agents, and Ayala Panievsky, a Gates scholar here at Cambridge, indeed at my own college. And you, Ayala, I'm going to start with you because you have been studying populism. And I wonder if you could start with telling us, in this context, what do we mean by populism?
Right, so this is actually a pretty important question because in the popular conversation, in the public conversation, many times people talk about populism as basically everything they don't like. And this is not a very good analytical definition for us researchers, right? So to make it clear, populism is not about people who are very charismatic or politicians who are making simplistic arguments or leading very popular economic policies or anything of that sort. Populism, as defined by political scientists like Cas Mudde and Jan Werner Müller, and by now everybody's using their definition. So in the academia, populism means an ideology. We call it a thin ideology because unlike communism or neoliberalism, it doesn't provide specific solutions for problems. It's not about specific policies, right? It's not like I'm in favor of taxes or against taxes. That's not what it's about. There are very many kinds of populism. And that's why it's called a thin ideology, because it is combined with a more substantial type of ideology. So you have neoliberal populists, like we can think about Trump, we can think about Benjamin Netanyahu, who we will probably mention more in our conversation. And you can have just as much, you can have communist populists, you can have all kinds of populists. So what does it mean? If it doesn't mean these policy solutions, what is it really? So what populism is about is politicians and parties who divide society into two groups. And it's important to note that these groups, it's not just about us and them. People many times talk about us and them. It's important to realize that these groups are homogeneous. So it's not like societies consists of many groups with different conflicting interests and different kind of preferences and grievances. No, there are two groups, they are homogeneous, and only one of them is the real people. Who decides who is the real people? The populist. Okay, so usually it turns out that the real people is whoever is loyal to the populist, right? And the other group is the corrupt elite, who is the enemy of the people. We'll get to this term too, I imagine. And this is what populism is about. And in some cases, these elites can be economic elites. These elites can be cultural elites. It depends on the context, right? Whoever is against the populist is labeled as part of this corrupt enemy of the state. So this is what we talk about in the research when we say populism.
And of course, we're here talking about how the populist politician dubs the journalist who's trying to tell the truth, as we would see it, as the enemy of the state and the enemy of the people. So you have studied Benjamin Netanyahu, and you say that he was one of the first politicians in a democratic country to really cleverly use these populist ideas against journalists.
Right, so we can talk about what it means that Israel is a democratic country and where do we stand on the spectrum of democracy. But it's true that back in 2015, I started listening to Donald Trump, who back then kind of decided he's into politics now. And it sounded pretty familiar to me. I was like, I know this tune. I know it pretty well. And I've been a journalist for many years back in Israel in a newspaper called Haaretz. And I realized when I heard the new politics of the right in the US, that for me, that was not new. And actually in Israel, journalists have suffered this kind of attack for many years. And I was trying to figure out, why has the media failed so colossally in coping with populist attacks and populist media bashing? Because to me, it was clear, because I know journalists, and many of them are super bright and super committed, and they have the best intentions, and and they have a lot of power, because the media and the institutional media, despite everything, despite social media and all that, is still very much very, very powerful. And they have the mic. I was like, how come they are so bad at this? I mean, they have so much power in their hands and they're so talented. And they want to do, many of them want to do the right thing. So that was my starting point, basically, when I started doing my research. And since then, I've conducted dozens of interviews with journalists in Israel and Palestine, in the UK, in the US, and also public surveys and other types of analysis to figure out what happens to journalism after a decade of populism in power, which is what we had in Israel. And I think if you've been following the news even slightly from Israel in recent days, I would say that everything you see coming from there now, the judicial overall, has a lot to do with this decade of taking over the media. And the reason I'm saying that, although so many people here are probably from the UK and more interested in the BBC and Gary Lineker and all that, is that I'm afraid that Israel should serve as a cautionary tale for journalists and scholars and citizens in other countries who feel safe in their democracy, but are seeing disturbing processes. Because what I would argue, based on our experience, is that if you fail to counter anti-democratic populism on time, it might get much, much more difficult to do in the future, because after a decade of populism in power in Israel, the media landscape looks entirely different now. And now it's more difficult to fight back.
So turning to you, Emily, how have we seen these techniques of the populist politician used to discredit and undermine journalists, particularly television journalists and radio journalists, who have been traditionally, and still are, very highly trusted by the British people?
I think I come to this as somebody who was a working journalist and is a working journalist whilst everything started to change around us. And one thing that I became really convinced of, and listening to Ayala, it was really interesting, the points that she has made and the way that she has approached this. We didn't have the tools. We were quite naive, I think. And it took me a long time to realize that the phrases that are thrown out are not sort of coincidental. They're not sort of thrown away. There is a vocabulary, there is a language, there is a framework to how populism works on journalists. And you start noticing the tropes after a while. So one of the things is, as Ayala was suggesting, this idea of being enemies of the people. Now, it's a really, really obvious but devious way of separating those in power from the people who are doing, as it were, the accountability. So one of the ways that populism works is by saying, we're the people in power and we want to speak directly to the people, as Ayala suggested, the real people. And the journalists, the media, are the ones getting in the way. Why? Because they're the ones who are trying to hold those in power to account. That's what we do. That's part of our brief. And so if you set up this idea, if it plays into the public's mind that somehow the journalists are the enemies of the people, then you create that division. And what you really want to do as a populist is undermine public trust in journalists and journalism, so that you don't have to worry about that. You know, it was Trump himself who said openly, I mean, a lot of the most extraordinary things Trump says are the sort of honesty that comes from the open mic when he doesn't necessarily mean it. But he said to a sort of major CBS anchor, Leslie Stahl, he said, the reason I try and undermine you lot, the reason I'm always demeaning you is so that when you say bad things about me, no one believes you. And I think once you've understood that there is a sort of aspect to populism, which is literally about trying to sow distrust in the media so that nobody buys what journalists say anymore, then a lot of other things become clearer. So I was working at Newsnight when we first started interviewing the people I would call the sort of the accolades around Donald Trump. I interviewed Trump himself many times and his family. I would almost say in a sort of pre-populist age, but certainly once Trump was president, or once he was even in the running, people would come onto our show, to Newsnight, and they'd say, oh, you're all fake news. You do fake news. We don't buy this. And it took me so long to understand that I wasn't meant to, at that stage, sit there defending our output. I wasn't meant to take it seriously. I wasn't meant to say, oh, well, can I just explain that actually what we did was we did 50% on that, and then we did 50% on that. And actually, I think you'll find if you break down, the answers we got from Labour versus the answers we got from the Conservatives versus the answers we got from the Democrats, the Republicans, they want to try and get in your head. And that's a very, very powerful thing. So as a journalist, your credibility is always the most central thing, right, to what you're doing. If people stop believing that you're doing a good job or a fair job, then basically you're done, you're finished. So you have to preserve this sense, even when you're live on air, of saying, actually, this is what we've done. These are our processes. This is how we try and be fair. And what you suddenly realize is that you're being led down a path of defending your work, and they are getting away without answering your questions. So if you're trying to talk about the Muslim ban, for example, or if you're trying to talk about the Access Hollywood tapes, or if you're trying to talk about Trump's separation of children in cages at the Mexican-Texan border, then all somebody has to do is put you on the defensive, where you are suddenly the one that feels you have to be accountable, and you've stopped asking questions, right? And it's so simple, because you've spent half the interview justifying yourself or your organization or the BBC or why you're doing this interview, and you've let them off the hook because they don't have to answer anything that you've just put to them.
So they're manipulating your fear of not being perceived to be duly impartial when they say things to you like, well, you with your left-wing question, you out-of-touch liberals. Emotionally for you, what does that feel like?
Well, again, it makes me feel ridiculously naive. I mean, do you remember the coffee? I'm going to call it the posh coffee discussion, right? Which was that people used to stand there and lecture me without knowing actually what hot beverage I ever order or drink, as if I was a posh coffee consumer, right? And the people that were lecturing me were people who, for context, I grew up in the north of England in Sheffield. I went to a state school, a comprehensive, and I have sort of worked in a variety of public sector and private sector jobs. But somehow I was always being told that I was the elite. And quite often it was by people like Nigel Farage, who had been to public school, who had worked in financial trading, who also had, a German wife and a German passport, and clearly, was not somebody who had never had the money or the means or the opportunity of education and travel. And yet you are put in this place where you are trying to defend not being real. You're not the real person because you drink cappuccino, whereas they are somehow the real person because they go to the pub and they drink beer. And so these completely imaginary definitions are put in place, which again serves to try and make you feel that you're out of touch. And that's a really, really clever way of doing it, because once you've been told you're out of touch, you double check everything you say. And Ayala, I'll let Ayala explain this better, but when I read a phrase that Ayala used in her work, which was strategic bias, it opened up a whole kind of vista for me that I hadn't understood, which is that if somebody is accusing you of bias, quite often the response that journalists have is to lean into what they're saying, to try and prove that they're not right. Oh, hang on. I promise you I'm not. Look, I can do this, or I can drink beer, or I can be, more from the real people than you are. And so you start trying to play this really disingenuous, really inauthentic game, which is about leaning into their criticism of you. And of course, that's the point at which you stop being a good, impartial, thoughtful journalist. You've kind of played straight into their hands.
So Ayala, you have pointed to the fact that because journalists are terrified of being perceived to be liberal lefties, they actually they're unaware that they're being pushed to the right. And we're talking here about television and radio journalists. We obviously know there are right-wing newspapers who probably couldn't be pushed that much more to the right. So how does that work? And do you think the journalists are aware of it when it's happening to them? And do you think the audience can spot it?
So I think that it's important to realize, because many times when people talk about the populist media bashing and its implications, what it does, they talk about, oh, it undermines the public trust in the media because people say the media is fake and therefore it undermines the public's trust, right? And this is something very scary, especially for journalists, but also in general for our democracy. But another thing that happens, and is not less important, is what happens to journalists. And I think what we need to realize is that, yes, it's about attacking journalists' credibility, but the populist campaigns we see against the media, and it's not only in Israel, it's not only in the UK, it's not only in the US. We see in Germany the terminology of the Lügenpresse, of the lying press. We see in France the media cabal. So it's also important to realize it's a global phenomenon with different kind of manifestations in different cultures, but there is a playbook and it is consistent. And according to this playbook, it's not only about sowing distrust among the people, it's also about intimidating journalists and manipulating their professional norms against them. And what I mean by that is that apart from being scared or intimidated by armies of trolls that are attacking journalists nowadays in ways that they have never done before, just because the technology was not there, and especially women and people of color and religious minorities. So it's another layer of it, is that journalists' daily lives have changed dramatically because how the populist campaign now can incite online harassment and bullying and doxing and things that weren't part of journalists' lives when most people entered the profession, right? It's not what you guys assigned for, right? So we have this, and therefore it also changes how journalists do their work. And this is very concerning because it's very difficult to see when I get the news. I don't always know what happens behind the scenes, right? What kind of strategies journalists are using to show me that they are impartial or balanced or whatever that might be. And what I found in my research was that journalists have intentionally applied the strategic bias strategy. They didn't call it that, I called it that, but the strategy there means that it's not the kind of bias that we usually have in mind, where people are maybe unaware of their ideological kind of impact on what they are reporting. And it's not the kind of bias that you think about when you talk about the Daily Mail that is like openly. This is something else. This is what happens. The strategic bias is what happens when populist politicians manage to convince journalists that there is a problem, that they have a problem, and the problem is that they are too lefty or too liberal or too, it depends on the context. It has different names, but basically that this is the problem, and they are detached from the real people who support the populists, and that something should be done about this. And too many journalists I've spoken to thought that the way to fight it was to show the people that they are not really lefties. And how do you show that? You try to criticize the left more, right? To show that it's not like you are giving them a special treatment. You are trying to say kind things about the populist or his people when you can, even if it's hard, and it's often hard. and all kinds of different strategies to demonstrate how different you are from this portrayal of you by these populists. Unfortunately, not only so this strategy has terrible implications on a few different levels. So first of all, journalists end up participating in this claim or this presumption that journalists, that for instance lefty journalists are not good journalists. I mean, you kind of embrace the premise of the populist that you somehow need to show some kind of openness to the right in order to be a legitimate journalist. What does it mean for journalists who aren't? What happens with journalists who do believe in kind of that's still legitimate, right? It also means that journalists are trying to show how patriotic they are. It often leads to a more nationalistic kind of discourse. There is research that shows how in Germany, journalists under populist attack ended up, I would say, adapting their coverage of immigration to show that they are patriotic, i.e. care about the real people in Germany who are like, on the populist right and more strict on immigration. So you see it taking different faces in different countries. In Israel, it had to do about the occupation mostly, which is the occupation of the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza, which kind of disappeared from the screens over the past decade because it was considered a lefty topic, right? And nobody wants to prove to the audience that they are these lefties that everybody's accusing them of being. And the point is that at this point, the whole public conversation is shifting slowly but surely further and further to the right. And then what happens is not only journalists are not doing a good job, they are also limiting and narrowing the space of legitimate speech that they themselves can practice in the future.
So, Emily, in the United Kingdom, and you've talked about this, to what extent do you think it has meant that journalists, broadcasters have sometimes given too much airing to views which don't deserve to be heard or don't deserve to be heard much? And I think for this audience, it might be helpful if I explained that UK regulation of broadcasting does not require impartiality. It requires due impartiality. So you do not, for example, have to say, on the one hand, smoking is bad for you, but on the other hand, many people say smoking is good for you. You are allowed to give more weight to views that have too much, that have more credibility and more weight and evidence behind them. But to what extent do you think that in their fear of being thought not impartial, journalists have ceased to be duly impartial which is actually their duty as laid down by the regulator?
Look, I think it's something that we have struggled with. And I think if you go back to sort of, climate change and climate change denial, it's not that long ago that we used to put, denialists front and center, of some of our debates about the climate. And I think it took all these things, sort of take somebody to sort of make you stop and look in the mirror and go, are you really going to promote climate denial, in sort of mainstream broadcast media? And I think there is an argument that you need to recognize there are different views. There is no point in us saying that doesn't exist as a point of view, that, that there isn't anyone saying that, because actually all that does is send people to other places for their news. But it's what I always say, which is that it's about showing your workings, right? It's about showing your workings. If you have spent, and this is what I was, I guess, trying to sort of focus on during the sort of Brexit negotiations. If you are asking a question and the answer is, the first 10 economists that you call are all saying, I think Brexit is going to give us more red tape. And you say, oh, that's no good. I need to find somebody who's going to say it won't. Fine. You get your person who says, actually, I think Brexit will make things much easier and it will cut red tape. That's fine. I'm not saying you don't put that person on. I think you do put that person on, but you show your workings, you show your weightings. You say somewhere in your explanation or your introduction, we found 10 people that said this and we found one person that said this. We're still going to let that one person explain why they think this. And maybe there is something in it that we have to understand, we haven't understood. But please don't start thinking that this is an equal balance of opinion, because I think that's when we create problems for ourselves. We present something as a balance when often it isn't. And I think sometimes that's to do with the adversarial nature of the way that we sort of formulate debate, particularly in the medium, particularly I would say late night, because you're part of what you do is keeping people on their toes. Oh, they're going to argue with each other. That's going to be really entertaining. We won't see them bashing each other up. Whereas quite often there would be a whole sort of selection of views which get lost. And quite often the majority is sitting somewhere, somewhere in this rather grey, rather dull area where they can explain good and bad. And so I think what it comes down to is just showing your workings, like showing how hard you had to work to find the climate denier scientists, or whatever.
I mean, it has to be said that broadcasters in general, and particularly the BBC, were criticised by academics as well during and in studies conducted after the Brexit vote for a false equivalence. And there was not sufficient attention given, and on air, I'm not criticizing you for it.
No, I think it's
the fact that there was a huge weight of evidence on one side and much less evidence on the other side. And of course, recently and in the years since, we have seen why it was that all those economists were saying this doesn't stack up, and that therefore broadcasters let the public down. And perhaps, to speak to Ayala's point, because they were scared of being attacked for not being equal and fair.
Well, I'll give you a really recent example, actually, and this is not about populism, but it is about, I think, what Ayala was suggesting about sort of strategic bias. Just last week, we had the Chancellor on the newsagents, and it was the morning after his budget, and I was putting to him the economic forecast, which said, despite everything he'd done, Brexit meant we would fundamentally be worse off still as an economy. We'd find it harder to grow. We'd find it harder to trade. We'd be 4% worse, according to the OECD, I think it was. And I mentioned the Rishi Sunak quote. I don't know if our viewers will remember that when Rishi Sunak was in Northern Ireland and he was extolling the virtues of this wonderful place, where you could have this unique opportunity, because Northern Ireland was both in the EU and part of the UK. And I said, look, the cat's out the bag, isn't it? He's basically said that was the unique opportunity and we have given that up. And the Chancellor turned around to me and he said, oh, Emily, I wish you lot wouldn't start relitigating Brexit. And it was such an interesting phrase, interesting use of the word, because immediately it paints me as somebody who is possibly anti-democratic. Oh, you're not trusting the results of the referendum, or you're not accepting what's been done, or the will of the people isn't good enough for you. And of course, my answer should have been, this isn't about relitigating Brexit. It's about being honest about the economic costs. That's all I'm asking. You should be honest about the economic costs. But in that split second, and don't forget, as broadcast journalists, we're live and we're sort of human. And you hear the word relitigating and you think, oh, no, I mustn't be seen as that anti-democratic person. So you're constantly fighting this sort of, the perception that you're meant to be in, which is somehow you're going against the grain, you're going against the public, you're being the person who's not patriotic enough or not understanding enough. And that's the thing I think that we have to keep fighting. Yeah, I mean, when you talk about the sort of Brexit, the sort of the weighting in the academics, I remember very clearly before the Brexit vote, Craig Oliver, who was David Cameron's chief of staff, coming up to me at Wembley. We'd had the big debate at the Wembley Stadium. And he said, Emily, you've got to stop the BBC from correcting. They correct every time somebody comes on and talks about a problem that Brexit would create. They immediately put on somebody afterwards to say, no, it wouldn't. And he said, that's a real false equivalence, because actually you don't have somebody saying one thing and then somebody shutting it down. You have somebody saying one thing and then hopefully a team of experts who go and stress test that and work out, if it's true or not. And I think he was the first person. And that was literally the week before the debate in 2016, when he called it out and he said, this is going to go wrong if every time somebody says X, the BBC shoves Y straight after them, because it's going to create this false equivalence. And, arguably, I think that probably was where we ended up.
And it doesn't help the viewer to
get
work
to the bottom
out what the truth is.
Right.
I mean, a major issue we have in this country is that we are embarrassed and shy about calling politicians liars. And as Emily will know, just after he'd become Prime Minister, I asked the question publicly when I was head of news at Channel 4, what do we do when a known liar becomes our Prime Minister? And I believe there is a real issue, personally, I know I'm the chair, but I can give my view too, when we don't call out lies, when we let politicians say things and then we're terribly polite and say things like, well, many people might not agree with that point of view. And I'm not saying that we should always call politicians liars, but I feel that we are frightened to say the truth about lies. I don't know in your work, Ayala, in looking at other countries, the extent to which people do say that's a lie, that isn't true, there is no evidence for it, or are a bit polite so that viewers can't necessarily tell what you're getting at.
Right. So I think there was a similar kind of debate in the US that some of you might remember, that it was a big deal when the New York Times finally decided to say that Trump was lying about something. And looking back at it, it's a bit ridiculous, right? Because a lie is an actual thing. Like, people are sometimes lying, and that's what Trump did in this moment. And a journalist who wants to tell the people what actually is happening has to tell them that their president is lying, right? That's the job, basically. And the media is not intended to be a pipeline. Like there is a lot of literature, right, about the media and democracy and the role of media and democracy. And I'm not insinuating in any way that the media has done a perfect job before that in kind of promoting our democracy, but there is a role for media in democracy. And this role is not about creating symmetries that don't exist, right? There is a very brilliant book by Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky about how democracies die, and they say there very clearly something that many people know and feel, but they put it very beautifully. They say, when you cover in a balanced way an unbalanced reality, you are distorting it for your audiences, right? You're not doing your job. And in many countries now, the political sphere is asymmetrical. There is one political camp who lost it in many ways, lost their relationship with reality and facts. And I think that people don't understand how difficult it is for journalists who are trying to remain objective and balanced. What do you do? What do you do in this situation? Do you keep calling them liars? They would, of course, people will call you biased, and you don't want them to call you biased. So this is a very awkward position for many journalists. And I must say, I see people struggling worldwide in many different countries, and there has not been a perfect solution yet. But by now, since a few years have gone by with people struggling and kind of trying to improvise all kinds of solutions, by now, we do know a few things about covering this information. And we do know a few things about covering conspiracy theories, for instance. And we know a few things about debunking. We know that even merely repeating the lie is a problem, and that amplifying lies and conspiracy theories is a problem. And many times, journalists and news organizations are trying to do the right thing and debunk a lie. But by doing that, they spread the lie further. And people don't remember the refuting at all. They don't remember the debunking. They only remember the lie. And so there is a lot of fascinating research conducted in different parts of the world by neuroscientists and cognitive media scholars, kind of all kinds of different researchers about how to approach this information in a way that doesn't amplify it, basically. Because what we need to understand is that there is a change of paradigm here, and things changed, and the previous norms and ethos of journalism have become unhelpful in many ways, and even counterproductive somehow. So if in the past the threat for journalism was secrecy and state censorship and people kind of reducting paragraphs and like shutting things off, and then the solution was the sunlight, right? We need to like, the sunlight is the best disinfectant and everything, and democracies die in darkness and all that, right? That was the story. And journalists knew that the most important thing is to expose stories, because the bad guys are trying to hide things, right? And we are trying, transparency. But when you have people like Stephen Bannon put it beautifully, he said that his strategy was flooding the zone with shit. And you see it it's part of the playbook by now. You see it in many countries, and the same people are doing the same, are using the same strategy everywhere. And when you flood the zone with shit, then putting a spotlight on it is not the solution, right? You just get a lot of shit. Like, that's not what people need now. So we need to change.
You're not a neuroscientist.
No, I'm not.
How do you think that you as a journalist should deal with this? And are there strategies, Emily, that you have found to, now that you're no longer baffled and you've caught up and you know what they're up to, what are your strategies? Because I think they would be useful for all journalists to know.
There are certain trigger words that I'm really aware of now. So, witch hunt is one of those. And I did a 10-part documentary on J. Edgar Hoover and looked at McCarthyism. And of course, witch hunt used to be used very much in the frame of, what McCarthyism was doing to sort of free thinkers and liberals and all the rest of it. Now, when I hear the word witch hunt, I go back and just check, because quite often it's people who are trying to avoid scrutiny, and it's quite often people who don't want accountability. And I am very conscious of the preemptive strikes to undermine authority in institutions. And that sounds a very lofty way, so I'm going to give you a concrete example. At the moment, in the UK, we're waiting for the parliamentary inquiry into whether the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, willfully misled the Houses of Parliament. He's going to give evidence on Wednesday. Now, in a normal sort of setting, in a normal framework, we'd say, well, that will happen on Wednesday, 2:00, we'll see the parliamentary inquiry, and we'll see the ex-Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister sit down, and we'll kind of take everything that is said then at face value. We'll try and understand what the committee's asking, we'll try and understand the Prime Minister's sort of response, and at the end of that, presumably the inquiry will write up their report, and MPs will go away and have a free vote on it and make up their mind. But actually, what we're seeing now, going back to the preemptive strike, is a concerted effort to try and make the parliamentary committee itself look as if it is a Labour witch hunt. Now, if you look closely at the makeup of the parliamentary committee, you'll find that, yes, it's got a Labour leader in Harriet Harman, but it's also got more members of the Conservative Party as MPs sitting on it than Labour. And yet, as soon as you try and diminish this institution, what should be an authoritative, neutral, cross-party committee trying to come to an understanding of whether the House of Parliament was or wasn't misled. As soon as you undermine that by using words like witch hunt, what you're basically saying is, we've discredited what they're doing before they've even sat down. So you don't need to look here because they're going to be lying to you. And so these are some of the things that we, certainly today we've talked about that to our listeners as a way of saying, just watch out for that. Whatever happens on Wednesday, watch out for the fact that there are already people doing the rounds now. They're sending emails, they're close allies of the former Prime Minister, and they will be trying to get MPs on side already by saying, don't listen to this, they're a bunch of socialists, right? And in a perfect world, I don't want to go around calling everyone a liar, quite frankly. Your speech was incredible and brave, Dorothy. When you gave that speech, you were saying something nobody had kind of, you crossed a threshold. But as a journalist, in my daily life, I don't want to go around calling everyone a liar, because quite frankly, it becomes a switch off. People kind of go, oh, she's made her mind up, or they've said that, or, they're not dealing with, things as they come. So it's really important for us to actually take each separate statement or each separate claim or qualification and analyze it. That's the best thing that we can do. We can say, well, where are they coming from on that? But I think you're right. Ultimately, we're not trying to find a balance where there isn't a balance. We're trying to get through to something that is informative, that will actually help our audience get one step closer to understanding the story that we're trying to tell.
And Ayala, one of the key things for the populist is, as Emily says, to undermine the institutions they have traditionally trusted. In the UK, you hear it said a lot, nobody trusts the mainstream media anymore. And in fact, Michael Gove often calls the media this strange thing, the media, which is a sort of insulting word with about 4 E's in it. And it's constantly said, even by journalists, that nobody trusts and believes the mainstream media, and that young people never watch it. But actually, we're lucky here. We have a regulator, Ofcom, who regularly studies and does surveys on who is trusted, and who is not trusted is politicians, and social media is not trusted. But still, about 3/4 of people say they have high levels of trust in broadcast media, that they rely on it more than any other form of media. And also, we can see that in things like the pandemic, they turn to television and radio, but we ourselves, as broadcasters, have believed the lie that nobody believes us. And I don't know if you have seen that in other territories as well, that journalists become undermined not just in themselves in an individual interview, but that they sort of stop believing in journalism. They themselves have fallen into the trap.
So I think you're very right that in recent years there is a lot of and especially since social media became a thing that consumed our world, there is this belief that mainstream media or institutional media is going down and nobody's watching it and nobody trusts it. And the trust question is more complicated, and I'll get to it in a second, because in this sense, the UK is slightly different than many other countries. But when it comes to being relevant, when it comes to people watching it, consuming it, we know that the institutional media is still very, very powerful, both in the UK, in Israel, in other countries as well. And in these public opinion surveys that you see every couple of years, that like 25% of young people only get their news on TikTok and all this kind of like moral panic, when you do a better kind of survey or you check it further, you see that most people even those who get their news on social media usually mean that they click on the link that their grandma posted to the BBC or something like that. So still many, many people get their news from the mainstream media or the institutional media. And it is extremely powerful. And even what people see on social media is usually dictated, and the agenda is dictated. The things we talk about them because of the big news organizations who set the agenda. That's one thing. The question of trust. In many countries, the situation is more complicated, and the public trust is undermined in surveys, or even more so polarized. So in many countries, you have, for instance, right-wing voters with lower and lower levels of trust, whereas left-wing voters have maybe better levels of trust. So it gets polarized. In the US, you can see it just, it goes like that, something like that, like the Democrats and the Republicans, right? And the more they love Trump, the less trust they have in the media. What I think happens many times, and I've just now conducted research on it. It's fascinating. I can't wait to write this article, because we asked people, because usually you ask people, do you trust the media? Do you distrust the media? Or in the more sophisticated questionnaires, you ask, how much do you trust the media from 1 to 10, right? But it's not just about trust, because if you see the populist campaign against the media, it is intended to trigger not only distrust, but also hatred and hostility and resentment. And this world of feelings, it's not unrelated to trust, of course, but it creates a whole new bunch of problems to democracy, because we've seen around the world in many countries, journalists being intimidated, facing online violence, real world violence, harassment, all kinds of behaviors that were never part of journalists' lives if they weren't like covering wars. So we see a whole new world of problems. And what seems to happen is that when people are asked, do you trust or distrust the media? They would say distrust the media because this is the negative option. But if you ask them what they think about the media in an open question, which is what we did, they actually tell you they hate the media. And this is something slightly different, because they still get their information from the media, but they hate them. Okay, so it's a bit more complicated, and we are trying now to take the research on media trust to the next level with this more complicated understanding of different groups in society, because different groups have different reasons to distrust or resent the media. So I think the question of trust is complicated, but definitely the media still has enormous power, which makes it so stupid, I would say, that they don't cope better, or yeah, they fail us basically, right? Because it's, in the end, it's about the people and what we get to know.
So in the US, they got rid of media regulation, and we've seen the effect of that. In the UK, we still have media regulation. So actually, our media is pretty fair compared to many countries, not perfect. But Emily, when it comes under attack, and particularly the BBC, they go right for the BBC all the time. I always felt I was lucky at Channel 4 because there was the BBC taking all the attacks. Why do you think they attack the BBC in particular? And how do you think the BBC should react to those attacks? And also the journalists themselves, how can broadcast journalists themselves unite better to defend ourselves?
Look, I think the BBC and its journalists do an incredible job. They really do an incredible job. And sometimes you sort of need to be out to look back and say, you should just be really proud and really vocal about the extraordinary work you do. And sometimes it's just about that. It's about having the backbone to say, actually, I'm going to support those journalists. I think they've got this one right. I'm not going to, demoralize them or sort of undermine them or, make them apologize and stuff. I think basically, if you had a more robust approach sometimes to say, actually, we're really happy. We think we do a pretty good job most of the time. And of course, everyone gets things wrong. All broadcasters get things wrong. And it's easy to actually put up your hand quickly and go, yeah, that was a misstep. But, actually, we take that on the chin, look at the amazing work we've done and be quite sort of proud of it. And sometimes I think as a sort of nation, we're slightly apologetic. And I think that's wrong. I think the fact that we have got this license fee, which is quite often called a sort of forced tax, misses the point of just what you can get, what you can get for that, yearly sum and what it offers and actually what it gives us in terms of the cultural range and depth and entertainment and all the rest of it. And I think sometimes at the BBC, we've sort of failed to recognize that the people who are making the attacks are people with vested commercial interests. If you're being attacked by people who'd like to have your business or like to have your audience or like to be getting that money, then you have to look at it in a different way. It's not the same as being attacked by a regulator, or I don't mean attacked, but being, rebuked by Ofcom or rebuked by a regulator. If you're literally being undermined by your commercial rivals, then, occasionally you should just be sort of showing them the door and saying, thanks very much for your thoughts. I think we're doing okay.
Do you think that sometimes broadcasters could be more overt about that? That when they talk about the right-wing press, actually, they should be telling the viewers, the ones who want our business.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there has been this mistaken idea that and it goes back again to Ayala's sense of strategic bias, that if you keep the government of the day happy, you'll get more money in the license fee. If you keep the press on side, you'll get nicer reviews. I think we've been through enough, I think we've had enough decades and enough rounds of the license fee payments and all the rest of it to know that isn't right. You can have a BBC which is very, very friendly towards the government of the day. And you see what happens when it gets to the license fee settlement. They get a 2-year freeze, no money, and they're having to make sort of fairly big drastic cuts and mergers and all the rest of it. And so actually just trying to, if you like, separate out the money that comes from government and your editorial independence, because fundamentally, I pay my license fee because I want the editorial independence. I want the broadcaster to do what it does best, which is create amazing programs and report well and entertain well and inform well. And I don't want to think, they're doing that because then they might get another 200 quid from whoever's in power. So I think it's about that recognition more than anything else.
So you've said that we should stick up for ourselves, we should be transparent about how we came about the information that we're using to tell a story. Finally, I wonder, first, Ayala, if you've got any advice or tips from looking around the world of what we should be doing as journalists, but also the people watching this, our viewers, what should the public be doing and saying?
Right. So unfortunately, I have more examples for what not to do, but I will try to give a few tips about what to do as well. So about the strategic bias, we just know by now that not only it provides bad journalism, it's also not working. So Israeli journalists have tried it for a decade, shifted further to the right. It didn't prevent more criticism, and it didn't gain the public's trust or anything of this sort. So this, we know, can be dropped by now, right? And I think that when it comes to journalism, the area where you have a lot of evidence and research, we know by now that you shouldn't air lies and conspiracy theories. You shouldn't quote these things. You shouldn't amplify them when you can, because by using the words of disinformation spreaders, basically, you are strengthening their narrative, and you are taking the debate to exactly the areas that they want it to take place, and not where you think what is important and the terms you think the debate should be about. So one thing we know is that repeating populist disinformation is bad for the media, is bad for the public. It should be avoided. And there is this term of the truth sandwich that George Lakoff from Berkeley University coined about how to cover, what to do basically when you have a populist figure in power who is spreading lies daily, and how do you cover that? Because you have to, because they are in power, right? You have to cover that, but how do you cover it? And one of the things you should make sure that you're doing is that you're telling people the facts, and doing that before and after you communicate the lie. Because at the beginning, you frame the conversation and you decide and you check and know which terms should define this conversation, what people should actually know. And then you tell the lie and you explain why it is a lie, what is the manipulation, hopefully why is it being said, what is the motivation behind the lie. And in the end, it's important to return to the facts, because this is what people will take with them. It's important that we hear more truth than lies, because in our minds, it is perhaps fucked up, but we refer to familiar information. We attribute much more kind of truthfulness to information that we know that was repeated more to us.
Now, we've just got a very short time left, so sorry. I want you to imagine, Emily, you're not talking to an old lady like me. You're giving one piece of advice to a young journalist in the face of all these attacks. What would you say?
I think it's take the audience with you. Hold their hand. Don't be scared. What we always say on the news agencies, we'll take you behind the curtain. You can be transparent. If you're interviewing a friend, say, actually, you know what, this is a friend of mine, and I'm going to tell you that so that you don't find out from somebody else and assume there's a conspiracy behind it. The other thing I'd say is be very careful when you're clipping things up, because the knee jerk is to just go for the shortest, pithiest, angriest, shoutiest headline. And quite often you do yourself so much more of a favor, and you help the audience if you put it back in its context. Don't give people 10 words, give people, a clip that lasts 2 minutes, then they can see where it came from, where it's going. You get a response, you get another question, you might get something bolted together that just gives a bit more context. And I think if we can be the ones that actually take some of the heat out, if we can say it's not all about, your ever rapid click, it's kind of like the context and a more genuine approach to actually the conversation you've had, then I think we're probably doing a better job as journalists.
Thank you both very much. Lots of depressing ideas at the beginning, but some very positive and robust defense of journalism and truth at the end. That was a fantastic discussion. And thank you to everybody who listened to us. And now I would just like to say goodbye, and don't forget to watch many of the other Cambridge Festival sessions.
Thanks, Dorothy.
Thanks.
Thank you.